question I wanted to start with Bill, if that's okay, is because Facebook is one of the world's biggest companies now. It's getting bigger and bigger. And
depends on how you measure.
Yeah, it depends on how you measure. By market value, it's certainly getting up there. But anyway, so you guys use a lot of energy and have a big footprint. So is your role? Tell us a little bit about your role and how you balance what are the business needs of the company versus which is sort of a sense of being a good corporate citizen.
Those are mostly not in conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So we do use, I guess it's fair to say, a lot of energy. We use a lot less than many companies. We use, I think in 2013, which is the last year we released data for, we use on average about 90 megawatts. Okay, so for those of you who aren't engineers or physicists, a toaster uses about a kilowatt. So 90 megawatts is about 90,000 toasters on 24/7. That's a lot of toasters. So that's a lot of energy. But compared to many other large enterprises, it's actually pretty small.
Is this including data centers?
That is mostly the data centers. Yeah. I mean, the data centers are 97% of our electricity consumption, which is pretty much what our energy consumption is. So we feel a responsibility to be responsible about that, A, to use as little as we can, and B, to make the energy we do use as clean as we can. So for years now, we've been focused on energy efficiency, and we design and build our own data centers, so the buildings that house the servers, and as well as the servers and all the other equipment that goes in the data centers. And the buildings are interesting because you take this building, it's full of people right now. On a hot day, it might get hot in here, so you got to have air conditioning, and the people themselves, each of us is about 100 watts, so like a light bulb. It's like we got a whole lot of light bulbs in this room right now. That's heat that you got to get out of here, or over time the heat builds up and it gets really warm. So you need some kind of air conditioning system to do that. So take 90,000 toasters and turn them on and put them in a building. There's a lot of heat you got to remove, or the temperature starts to rise. So typical data centers, for every watt that goes into the computers, spend another watt to run the air conditioners to move that heat out of the building. So their overhead is kind of 100%, which is pretty bad. When data centers were small, that was fine. As data centers got bigger and as energy costs started to rise, that wasn't so fine. So we design our own. We use about for every watt that goes into the server, we use for all the overhead of the data center itself, less than 10%. Okay, so about 8% is overhead. So we've gotten rid of 90% of the typical overhead. In the facility itself, we've also made the servers more efficient. So efficiency is important, but we still use, as you said, a lot of energy. So we made a commitment several years ago to eventually get to 100% renewable energy powering our facilities. And we didn't say we're going to do it by date X because we didn't want to end up having to do something that was not economical, so that's where the business concerns come in. And we didn't want to simply go out and buy a marketing claim that didn't actually change what was on the grid, which is what a lot of people honestly do. So instead, what we did is we set a near-term target a couple years ago in 2015 that we would be at 25% clean energy. And I expect we will hit that. We're in 2015 now. And we expect then to increase that number substantially in the coming years. So basically, we're using as little energy as we can, and we're working on energy efficiency across the whole stack. It's not just the hardware in the data centers, it's also the software. If you have a really efficient computer and write really crappy software, you can use a lot more energy because you need a lot more computers.
Yeah.
And then we're working to make the energy that goes into it as clean as possible.
That's interesting. Angela, I'd love to get you to jump in here. How difficult is it to really bury in and understand whether or not a company is being truthful about its claims, and what role can sort of outside groups play in helping hold their feet to the fire? So to speak?
Well, so unfortunately, that outside group today is often an eco-label. So, or people have sort of perceptions as to what might be important. So we go to the grocery store and you look at cage-free eggs, and I don't know, what if it was in a bin? Is that cage-free? And is that even a thing, right? And so similarly, if you look at a tea bag, is it the aluminum staple or is it the bleach of the tea bag itself that's harmful? How does a buyer make a decision and how do you actually compare products effectively if you don't know what matters the most for environmental sustainability, social sustainability, and economic sustainability that align with your values, your personal values, and just the ground truth of what should matter? And so the difficulty is in the buyer being able to access the information about that particular product and the buyer knowing what they should care about so they can align their purchasing power with their values. Because we have two votes in the world. We can vote with the ballot and with our wallets. And so what we're trying to do is harness all that purchasing power in service of sustainable demand. Because if you stop demanding bad products, then bad manufacturing practices will stop. And so we're trying to harness that spend in the direction that it was intended to go. And to do that, we need a big data set, as big as Google, really. We're indexing how everything in the world is made, just as Google is indexing web pages. And so now a product's story and how it was made is accessible, and you have information as to what currently matters the most for each category of product. Then you can cross-reference those two things and make an informed decision. That decision won't be as calculated and as technical as having a carbon calculator or performing life cycle analysis, but there's a huge opportunity to the tune of trillions of dollars where simple value-based harnessing of your spend will make a tremendous impact. And so we're starting with cities because that's taxpayer money, and there are regulatory policies, thankfully, around requiring sustainable purchasing. So we don't have to do the evangelism. I'm an ecologist from Berkeley, and I care a whole lot, and you guys care a whole lot, but unfortunately, not everybody has the time or the energy to do the kind of research that we like to do for consumer products. These people are buying 2,000 different kinds of things all at once, and there's no time to do individual research. And if you do, it's inaccurate anyway. So that is the difficult problem at scale, and that's what we're solving with big data.
Yeah, I imagine a challenge there is getting people engaged so that they will want to do that sort of research, or whether or not it becomes just another marker on a label. So.
Yeah, he did a really great job explaining what he said. The toaster uses this much energy, and then you scaled it up. You'd have to do that for like every little metric to get someone to understand.
But the purchasing manager in a city doesn't have the time to do that or the expertise.
Right.
Mm-hmm. But if you can provide a service that does it for that person and somebody in another city and another and another.
And George, that's something that you're trying to do as well with helping researchers kind of tell a story around some of the different studies that they're trying to do. What are some of the biggest challenges that some of these researchers are running into that's making it difficult, and what can they do to improve?
So I guess I should start with saying a really good example of this is we have this one researcher who's up in Greenland. His name is Professor Wenchow. I'm totally butchering that, but he testified before Congress about global warming and all these kinds of things. The thing that blew me away about his project was he said, okay, I just need $7,000 and I'm going to put these sensors underneath this glacial ice and test it and see what the temperature is. The first thing I said was like, how come that's not a thing already? Like, that's insane. So I think one of the crazy thing about those kinds of situations is like you realize he's like a very well-known professor, and like people like him are kind of like taking the burden of global warming, and they have to deal with it like day to day, which most of us do not have to. And so like the weight of all that is kind of like on them. Like they're trying to figure out, like they're trying to collect all this data, figure out what exactly is going on. Mm-hmm. So those are the kinds of stories I think that are like really interesting. And I think one of the challenges is like, even if they do have the data, even if they get all the funding, they have the data, it's really hard for them to get people to care. Because you're usually not dealing with it day to day. I took a really long shower this morning, and I feel really bad about it.
You should.
So like,
were you eating almonds while you were showering?
Most possible combination.
side of B.
In B, yeah.
So yeah, that's what I would say. That is like two of the biggest things.
That's good. I mean, Karl, I'd love to get you to jump in here. Something that I think you can speak to that I think is interesting is to the issue of the environment seems to be very different from region to region. In the developed world, in the Western world, it means one thing, but in the developing world, it means something different. And in a lot of the communities that you're working with, it means something entirely different than what we're talking about here today. Can you talk a little bit about the work that d.light is doing and the mission that you have?
Yeah, sure. So we talk a lot about how we can improve in the developed world in terms of better efficiency in data centers, conserving water in various ways. But once you start talking about the developing world, a lot of justice-related issues come up because you have 1.2 billion people in the developing world that currently lack access to electricity, an additional 1 billion that have very intermittent access, meaning perhaps 4 hours or less a day. And in order to get all of those people online and consuming power, that's obviously going to cause a lot more burden on the planet. But at the same time, how can we say, all right, we in the developed world are allowed to consume all these resources, but you in the developing world are not. And so there's been kind of a debate related to that recently. However, in our view, it doesn't have to be an either or. And so just for some history behind what d.light does, d.light was actually founded in 2006 by Sam Goldman and Ned Tozin. And Sam was in, what country was he in? Benin. He was in Benin. That's my coworker over there. So Sam was in Benin, and he was doing Peace Corps, and he witnessed firsthand the damages that kerosene can cause. He saw someone who was terribly burned in a kerosene fire. And at that point, he realized, it's crazy that, over 1 billion people in the world today use kerosene as their primary lighting source, which is a big fossil fuel emitter, a lot of carbon. And so he said, why aren't people using, a solar lighting device? And so his mission in starting the company was to eradicate the kerosene lantern. And so what we're doing today is we have a wide variety of products ranging from a basic solar lantern that consists of a solar panel, a lithium battery, and an LED bulb, note the most efficient bulb out there, all the way up to things that are solar home systems that power multiple LED bulbs and very energy efficient radios. And
How much do they cost?
So the range of cost goes from our cheapest product retails for around $8, all the way up to our most expensive is around $125. And so basically you have a scenario now where you are providing people with a better source of lighting and a better source of power, because now they can charge their phones, they can have radio, they can do many other things, but now you're no longer consuming kerosene on a regular basis. You're no longer using a diesel generator to charge your phones. You're no longer using AA batteries continuously on your flashlights or your radios. And so it's actually better for the planet, but it's also a better source of energy for people in the developing world. And so it's kind of, you can have your cake and eat it too in this case.
There's also the human health impacts, right? And you mentioned the safety issue with kerosene.
There's safety. So kerosene, it's actually a very terrible form of energy. It's very dim, so it's very hard to read. So a lot of children have trouble studying at night. It has the burn risks that I just referred to. It has the health impacts.
Indoor air pollution.
Yeah, indoor air pollution. A lot of people end up with coughs and they have to go and seek medication, etc. I've seen a lot of this firsthand. I've worked a lot in Uganda and Kenya. And it's kind of terrible to see. And it's great to see the results when you bring someone one of these lanterns and they're finally able to see bright light in their home.
A lot of the work that you guys are doing and a lot of the work that's being done in the audience is things that are being done either by nonprofits or the private sector, and seem to be in little pockets where maybe the government is not doing enough. And so I'd be curious to get, maybe Angela, you can jump in here. where does the government's role fit in terms of sort of fostering some of this environmental protection that we're talking about here today? Is it failing? Where can things be done more?
Well, I mean, yesterday we saw recycling programs, and today we're seeing procurement laws via federal acquisition regulation, mandating at the federal level 95% compliance to sustainable procurement. And tomorrow, it's not a question of if, it's when. There will be a carbon tax. And so I see it as a directional transition to a sustainable economy. The alternative is we perish, and we don't want that to happen. So we're just going to transition to a sustainable economy. And I find that with government, a lot of the times people give attention to and use language when there is a tool for measurement. So it's measurement, it's status, it's competition that leads to behavior change. And you need that tool of measurement, of calibration first, for people to be able to speak about it and to have teeth in the regulation to actually mandate something be done by law. And so in the past, when we have a carbon calculator, you see leadership talking about carbon emissions, and if there is a tool that is agreed upon by chemists on life cycle analysis, people start talking about that as a real thing. And there has been no opportunity to have some kind of calibration metric on the various foods, goods, and services that we all consume and manufacture. And so for the first time, it would be negligent not to use this tool if this tool is available. And so sort of preemptively, we're seeing progressive companies, the Googles of the world and the Facebooks of the
Thank
world.
you.
and the cities that, like San Francisco, Portland, and the more progressive cities taking leadership in this space of previously spending manual time on this because they had to do it and they're trying to do it correctly. But unfortunately, compliance today without the tools of measurement just means that you have a process. It doesn't actually mean accuracy.
Right.
But when there's a tool that's available, I believe that the directional trend will be adoption. And government doesn't always have to be the laggard. I believe they can actually leapfrog because of this example of not having to evangelize sustainability when it's just legally mandated. And so there's an opportunity there to actualize that with accuracy rather than just process.
You mentioned procurement. I mean, Bill, what's a way in which Facebook, with its spending heft, can influence policy? I'm sure where you guys have data centers and you're in conversation, there's a lot of competition around the country to have where a data center is placed.
Would you mind repeating the question? Sorry.
I'm giving it a very long wind-up.
The pitch will be coming any minute.
The question is, to what extent can Facebook influence policy in its procurement? So if Facebook is building a data center and wants to have a lot of solar energy, can it impact how a utility approaches it?
So that's the hope. And I think certainly a lot of people have urged us to do that for years, and I think some people think it's easy, we should just go to the utility and tell them, we want wind, we want solar, give it to us, and the utility will say, here you go. It doesn't work that way. Utilities, particularly in regulated states in this country, and it's different in every state, it's different in other countries. Some states the market is very deregulated, so you can buy from lots of different energy providers. Some of them are wind farms, some of them are solar farms, some of them are coal plants. Texas is deregulated, so you can choose, which actually is great. What we need to do is get enough people to care to choose the green stuff. Many markets are not deregulated; they're much more regulated. There's a single franchise utility that has a franchise monopoly to provide electricity service. You can't go to them and say, "We want this," because they're going to say, "Well, we're not allowed to give you that. We don't have a tariff or regulatory." Approval to do that. So we got to change policy. I was at Google before I was at Facebook. Various companies have been doing this now for a number of years. For a long time, each company, when we were going to a place and looking, say, to build a new data center, we talked to a bunch of different sites, states and the governor and other people who want our business, and tell them what we want, and they say, we'd love to try to do that, let's see what we can work out. But when you're trying to site a data center, you've got months, not years, to make a decision. So in the time it takes them to figure it out, you have to make a decision. So what we've been doing the last couple of years is partnering with now about 40 other companies and 4 NGOs in what's called the Corporate Renewables Partnership to work collaboratively to really do several things. One is, one of the reactions we've gotten from a number of regulators and governors and utilities is, oh, we had no idea that companies cared about renewable energy. It's like, I don't know where they've been hiding, but we're trying to make sure they can't hide. So collectively, we're raising our voice and saying, we care, and you're more likely to get our business if you have options that allow us. We have renewable energy goals, and you're more likely to get our business if you have options that make it easier for us to meet those goals. And if you don't have good options, if you don't have policies that allow us to do it, you don't have tariffs in place for the utility to offer us something, then we might not even call you when we're looking for our next site because there are a dozen other places that do. So that's been a big part of it. That has gotten their attention, and now we're in discussions in a number of different regions. Now it's a few companies in each place who are talking to the regulators and the utilities and trying to work out what product offerings would look like that we would be interested in that they could do. The key is that they're not going to do something that has to be subsidized by other ratepayers, and we don't want that. Okay? So we want them to offer clean energy. We want it to be new. We don't want it just to be a shell game where they say, well, we've got some wind in our back pocket here. You can have this. Now everyone else has dirtier energy. We want it to be additional to what's on the grid today. It needs to be cost effective, but it can't be subsidized by everybody else. And that's really the challenge. So it's not easy. But I think we've finally got some much more productive conversations started than I've seen in years.
That's great. I'd love to throw it to the audience. Does anyone have a question?
I have a question for Bill. How do you know that your 25% energy is sustainable energy? I mean, how do you trace it back to where it's coming from?
We watch the electrons vary. So if we contract with, in Sweden, we have a data center in northern Sweden. The northern half of Sweden is 100% hydro. We are contracted with electricity providers there who run dams. Okay, so contractually,
that's an easy one.
So that's easy. Okay, in Iowa, we worked with the utility, Mid-American. I think they're about 40% coal in their sort of native mix. But in making that siting decision, we in the short time span we had to get this done, our energy manager, who just worked miracles to figure out a deal that was a win-win, good for us and good for them, that they build a new wind farm 60 miles from our site, and the energy is supplying our facility. So over the grid, right? So, I mean, you can't tell which electron is which, right? So the energy is going on the grid, we're taking energy off the grid, it's tracked using what are called renewable energy credits. The key is it was built because we went there, okay? So those are the easy ones, right? The harder ones are where you go somewhere and it's just whatever the utility has. Well, the utilities produce reports every year about what their energy mix is. And so we get those reports. It would be nice if they produce them. It takes them often months, if not at least a year, to actually produce that data. And it shouldn't be that hard, right? It would be nice if they all, say, by the end of Q1 could tell you what their mix was for the preceding year. It doesn't happen today. So sometimes we're working in terms of trying to understand what our overall mix is. We're working with data from utilities that lags by a year, but that's basically how we do it.
Please.
Hi, yeah, I had a question. I think it's also for Bill, but it comes sort of also from the ProductBio. Sorry, I can't read your name from here.
Angela.
Thank you. Sort of riffing on your comment about having a tool to measure things by, and then I remember something Bill said early on about not setting arbitrary deadlines for your goals. I'm with an environmental advocacy group focused on state government, and if something doesn't have a timeline, deadlines, or goals with years, then it's not real. And of course, they might have to recalculate. People might file extensions, whatever. But if there's not a deadline coming, then you're not really accountable to anything. So the question is, why not use, or have you considered using goals like finding a way to fit into the UN goals or the state's goals or the EPA's goals? Because they all have years associated with their goals, and Facebook's footprint might be big enough.
So the public goal we stated is 25% this year. Later this year, we'll announce the next milestone, and it'll be substantially greater a few years out, okay? And so we are accountable to those goals. So we announced 25% in 2015, 2.5 years ago, and we'll be held to account for that. I think you're absolutely right that if you say we want to be at 100% someday and then don't do anything, well then, I mean, we would be held accountable because people would be asking, how are you doing? What's your percentage this year? In fact, we started disclosing it. If we're not making progress in that direction, that's kind of our North Star. If we're just puttering along and not making any progress, we'll get held to account. I do think that concrete goals are important. We have internal goals that we haven't released publicly, partly because as a company, you know, if you sandbag, then you're going to get called out for that. If you set really aggressive goals, which in fact we do, but then miss them, you're going to get beaten up for that. It's you know, you can't win for losing.
Reach that 100%.
Right. So the 100, you know, we didn't want to say, oh, you know, 2025, 100%. Well, then we'd get to that point and we'd be at 93, and we'd either have to say, well, to get that last 7%, we got to spend a lot of money, which I would argue that's not the right solution, or we can spend a little bit of money to buy a marketing claim. And that's not the right solution either. So we're moving, I would say, when you talk about the UN goals or the EPA goals or state RPSs, we're moving faster than that. Okay, so in fact, that would slow us down. And we can, I mean, it's easier for us as a company in some ways, willing to take a leadership position to be very aggressive on this stuff and figure out how to do it cost effectively. That's easier than saying, let's take the whole grid to 50% or 100% in a few years. That's a very different proposition than us, supported by the grid as a whole, but saying we're going to get additional wind in Iowa, and we get to claim that.
Any other questions from the audience right now?
Bill, I'm also wondering about relativity. So do you compare yourselves with other tech companies out there that have a lot of server space? And so, so relative to them, is that how you set your goals? Or do you have sort of a ground truth in mind as to what the theoretical minimum impact it could be having is? And trying to get that. So when you say a percentage, is it percentage toward that theoretical minimum?
Or maximum in terms of its percentage of renewable energy. So we want to get to 100, or you can think of it as zero carbon, though not all our carbon comes from energy consumption. A lot of it is kind of internal, intrinsic, trying to understand what do we believe is possible, you know, and then what's maybe a little bit beyond that, because if we know this is possible, then probably we can do more if we're willing to be creative and give ourselves a few years. And then what do we know about what other companies are doing, because that helps us understand what's possible. And then there's, you know, certainly in public, we don't want to be setting a goal that's here when other people are up here. And if they're up here and we're down here, then there better be a damn good reason why we're not being as aggressive, right? So it's some of both.
And we see with the cities we're helping that while the regulations are on the environmental aspects of sustainability, given the opportunity and the tools, they also layer on things like we want to increase our spend on women-owned businesses, or we want to increase local procurement to spur local economies and job creation. And so even the dimensions that are not regulated on by an environmental purchasing policy, they will choose to add on additional ones if they have the opportunity to do so. So that's interesting.
Great. I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, I'm Boston Chen. Sorry to keep piling on you, Bill. So in data centers, there's a second problem, energy problem and materials problem, where because of Moore's law, servers are obsolete usually in about 2 years. You're actually better off getting a new one, getting twice the computing for half the power, half the everything. But that means there's a ton of embodied energy materials, some of them rare or toxic or both, that go into making the machines. And so as Facebook cycles through, what do you do with those machines? How do you handle that, both the embodied energy and the waste stream?
Well, the embodied energy is a sunk cost. You can't recover that, mostly. 2 years is aggressive. I think typically servers are good for a lot longer than that, but they're not good for decades. We look very carefully at when it makes sense for all sorts of reasons to refresh our, part of our server fleet. And it's based on all sorts of calculations, including embodied energy and what's called use phase energy, the energy that's used during the life of the server. We've done a first cut at a life cycle analysis of one of our servers to understand what the various elements are. Use phase actually dominates for a server enormously. For the cell phone in your pocket, embodied energy probably dominates the use phase energy. It's the other way around, because it's mostly sitting there using almost no energy. Effectively everything is turned off, because otherwise the battery would die in 5 minutes. Actually, mine lasts about 2 hours, but whereas in a laptop, same thing. It's in low power mode or asleep most of the time. The server's just on most of the time. And so the energy that it consumes during its use is way more than the energy that went into making it. So there is a point when it actually makes sense to swap it out, because the new one you're going to put in, even with the stranded asset, if you will, the stranded cost of that embodied energy, because it's going to be so much more energy efficient, you're better off stopping using the old, gas hog. And then there's the question of other resources, right? Most of the elements, when you think people talk about rare things, most of the things in there are not that rare, right? People talk about rare earths; they're actually everywhere. They're just many of them fairly diffuse, and they're pretty toxic in many cases to extract from the earth. That's the big issue. In some cases, energy intensive to get them out. Our servers, when we retire them, go through a sort of staged, first we try to remarket them, resell them, so that someone else can use them, if that's effective for them. And then we try to reuse the parts that actually are reusable. And then we recycle the rest. And that means disassembling it. There are major parts that are reusable or certainly recyclable. All the metal components can be recycled and sort of put back into the feedstock for whatever that metal economy is. And then the rest of the stuff basically gets smelted, and all of the metals and other things get extracted. There is some stuff that's left as essentially ash or slag that is then has to be disposed of, but that's very, very small. So we're doing the best this is the best that anybody knows how to do today with electronic equipment. It is an issue.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for listening and for you guys for participating.